Welcome to another episode of The Brand Called You, a podcast and podcast show that brings you leadership lessons, knowledge, experience, and wisdom from thousands of successful individuals from around the world. I'm your host, Ashutosh Garg, and today I'm delighted to welcome a very senior and accomplished veteran and a professional with expertise in leadership from Wisconsin, USA, Tom Oakley. Tom, welcome to the show.
Good morning. It's great to be here.
Thank you. Tom is the founder and chief executive officer of DTO Associates, LLC. He's also an independent director and a consultant. So, Tom, before we speak about DTO, tell me about your journey and what early experiences and influences shaped your interest in leadership and strategy.
Yeah, so I was looking at these questions and I have to laugh. I mean, I think that growing up, my father was a business guy, right? Well, he started out as a farmer and then he was a business guy,
Hmm.
and uh, and so our conversations around the dinner table, we had conversations about gross margin and sales operations and business around the dinner table. So I
Hmm.
think it was one of those things that was almost in my blood because we were used to talking about it all the time. That's
Yeah.
kind of what my dad did.
Hmm.
So, so I think that really sort of influenced some of that. I thought about being a doctor, but it seemed like business was my calling. So
Hmm.
that's what I did in school. And then, of course, I had to go into the Army. I had an ROTC scholarship undergraduate, and I went into the Army for 4 years after I got out of graduate school.
Hmm.
And that was an interesting study in leadership. I think that really sort of helped shape a lot of things.
Hmm.
One of the things in the Army is you find out that if you're capable, you get lots of work, and it doesn't matter what your rank is; they just keep throwing stuff at you.
Yeah.
And so you end up having to help get people to do things uh, that you need them to do, even if they outrank you. And so influence management was one of those skills that I think you really develop in the military, figuring out how you
Hmm.
get people to do what you want them to do, particularly if they don't really have to do it.
Hmm.
And I
Absolutely.
find that quite a useful skill in business across the years, right?
Yeah, and I can understand what you're saying because I mean, I'm not from the army, but my father was a brigadier general in the
Okay.
Indian Army. So I can understand the environment that you are talking about. But tell me, Tom, from your time in the US Army and your role as a captain, um, what were some of the leadership influences or approaches that you learned that you brought to the corporate world?
Well, again, I think influence management is really the key for me. I think that you know the interesting about the military, though, is that when you think about the military, you think it's maybe not applicable, but it's really about understanding your competition and
Mm,
putting the proper resources in place to address that competition in a way that you win, right? So in the military, it's people and equipment and firepower. In business, it's people and resources
mm,
and meeting their needs, right? So it's kind of a little different, but it's still trying to figure out where you know how do you what's your competition's vulnerabilities? How do you exploit those? And how do you use your resources to meet those needs in a better way to
mm,
be successful?
mm. Let's now talk about DTO Associates.
Okay, sure.
Tell me about DTO Associates. What is your mission and how does it reflect your own personal vision?
Well, so DTO Associates, I founded DTO a long time ago, and it's been somewhat of an on again, off again kind of a
Mm,
consulting business. I've seen sort of interspersed my career with periods of consulting and periods of working in the
mm,
corporate world. And the vision for it's really to help companies be successful, right? So there's what I found is particularly in smaller companies, there's just a real struggle with trying to figure out where their focus is, how do you manage people, how do you plan for succession,
mm,
um, or if you're or at the time when somebody's trying to leave or retire,
Mm.
How do you monetize this investment of time you've made
Yeah.
over all these years, right? So, and so many entrepreneurs um, think about running the business day to day, but they don't
Mm.
really think about succession. So these are the kinds of things I really wanted to do, is just figure out how to help companies be successful.
Mm.
And I've done this in the corporate world a number of times. I tend to go into places that are struggling, figure out where you're making money, where you're losing money, what are the key
Mm.
issues, identifying those things, making a plan to address those issues, and then working that plan.
Mm.
So I try to bring that to companies uh, that from a consulting perspective as well. And
Well
on
said.
occasion,
Mm.
yeah, on more than one occasion, I've ended up becoming the CEO of those companies
Yeah, yeah, yeah,
of
yeah.
a client. So yeah.
Absolutely. You've also done a lot of work in helping companies transform or turn around. Can you give me an example without any names of a
Sure.
successful turnaround?
Sure. So I was working. It's interesting because I've spent a lot of time in drug development, but this particular example is from the printing industry.
Mm.
There was a company that I was working with that had bought a company, and they paid too much for it, and they probably shouldn't have bought it. And
Mhm. Mhm.
they had some real issues in terms of uh, they were having to
Mhm.
move the whole operation someplace else. And they were just trying to think about it in terms of, how do I take these two machines and move them into a new place? And there was no thought around new capabilities. There was no thought around how old was the equipment, how much future did it have. And so I worked with these folks, and we were able to um, move their equipment. We actually, instead of moving their equipment, we traded these two machines for a machine that had capabilities that were twice that and
Mm.
significantly more future capability, and moved them to a new facility, and really enabled the company to take another step, a
Mm.
bigger step into the market, addressing digital printing and those sorts of things that they weren't really in before.
Yeah.
So this is one of those things. Sometimes the dog catches the car, and then you got to figure out, what am I going to do with it before I
Correct.
get the death on the pavement, right? And so
Correct.
that there's one there. Another company that I went to really couldn't figure out. They had a multiple lines of business, and they really didn't understand where they were making money. And I was able to go in and help them, just really dig through their financial information
Mhm.
and pull things together and understand where the money was being made, where the money wasn't being made,
Yeah.
and help them focus on the A, fixing the things that weren't working, and B, leveraging the strengths that they had.
Mm.
We're able to get that company to a point where had pretty strong EBITDA, and we're able to sell them to
Mm.
another company, and make the founders some pretty good money. So yeah, it's
Mm.
really just about
Mm. Amazing.
understanding.
Great examples. Thank you. Moving on, Tom, what do you believe are some of the most critical qualities of a successful business leader today?
Well, I think that um, yeah, I think some of the most successful qualities really are around um, understanding understanding your people's capabilities,
Hmm.
right? I think you've got to really understand your people's capabilities. But I think it's all part and parcel of the whole thing, right? So what's my vision for the company? Where am I taking this company? And understanding clearly, what do we do? What is our core strength and our core capabilities, right?
Mm.
And then how do I and then um, once you understand that, then building a strong plan to go to the market, and
Mm.
really be able to communicate what the mission of the company is, and what you can and how you can meet those needs in the
Yeah.
marketplace. And then, of course, operating the company, I think you have to be a really, really good listener. You have to understand,
Mm.
listen to your people. You need to pay attention to the folks who are doing the work every day, understand and leverage their knowledge every
Mm.
day about what are they doing, and how could it be better.
Yeah.
Just for example, I was I was at one company, and I decided that I was going to. I just got in there, and I said I was just going to go. We had a big cafeteria, and I decided I was going to go to lunch, and a couple times a week, I was just going to go ask people if I could sit down with them and chat. And uh, and one of the questions I always like to ask them was, uh, "What are three things you do every day that you think are kind of stupid? You
Mm,
don't understand why you're doing them." And often they would come up with things, and it was easy to get them to tell you that. And sometimes I could say to them, well, let me help you understand why we do that, right? So, yeah, it sounds kind of stupid, but here's why we do it, and here's why it might make sense. And other times it was like, well, yeah, I don't know why we're
mm,
doing that. So let's find out. And we could make some real changes. So I was able to doing that technique. It was really
mm,
great. We found out things that we were just wasting time on and things that were kind of dumb.
mm,
And I think, part of that was giving people control over their work, right? So the more control people have over their work,
mm,
I think the happier they are and the more productive they are. So I think this whole sense of understanding your people, being able to listen, not being too proud to take advice from the people who are working for you,
mm,
and implement that, I think it makes a huge difference.
mm, mm.
And of course, there's the day-to-day stuff like, okay, what are my metrics? How do I manage to them? And how do I make decisions?
Yeah,
And
great
database
response.
decision making is the key, right?
Absolutely. Great response. And what is your approach to strategic planning in uncertain or volatile businesses?
Yeah, that was I saw that question. I was like, part of me goes, I don't know. You do the best you can.
Yes.
But no, so strategic planning under uncertainty, I think it's really one of those things where you have to understand what's your destination. Okay, what
Mm,
are your goals, right? So there's always going to be uncertainty. There's always stuff happening around
mm,
you that makes
mm,
that there's a lot of noise, right? So you got to be able to understand what's
mm.
noise and what's really important. And I think if you have a destination for your company in mind, if you understand your purpose
Yeah.
and you understand, um, where the market is going to a certain extent,
Mm,
uh, and you stick to your plan and you execute that plan, um, I suppose not to, you don't want to go destroy. I've got my plan. I'm sticking to it. Um, you need to be ready to pivot, but um, I don't think you need to be reactive, right? You got
mm,
to look at data, you got to make decisions, you got to say, okay, I understand where the trend is. Maybe we need to pivot a little, but you
mm.
have to stick to your plan, right? So
Yeah.
if you're looking at your destination, a lot of this other stuff over
Mm.
here, it's just noise, right?
That is true. The other thing that I've seen throughout my career is that, businesses or leaders have great strategies, but they
Mhm.
fail in execution. How do you ensure alignment between strategy and execution?
Well, so much strategic planning is we're going to do our strategic plan, and then you
Mm,
spend months and months and months doing your strategic plan, and you end up with a book about this thick, and then you say, we're done with that.
mm,
And then you set it up on the shelf, right?
mm.
Um, you know, so I think strategic planning is important because like I said, it's understanding your destination. What's the point on the
Yeah.
horizon to which you're driving, right? But I think that if you don't operationalize that plan, you got a problem.
Yeah.
So, I think that I always say build the plan and then work the plan, right? So you got to build the
Mm.
plan, work the plan.
Yeah.
Uh, and so as part of that is you take that strategic plan, and if it's a 5-year plan, what are we going to
Mm,
do in year one? What are we going to do in year two? What are we going to do
mm,
in year two? And you develop milestones and measures along the way. So the metrics, the milestones, all those things
mm,
have to align with your strategic plan and so that you'll get there. But
yeah.
if you don't have measures and you don't have metrics and you don't have um, milestones, it's just going to be a waste of time. So it's just a
Mm,
strategic
mm,
plan sitting on the shelf, right?
mm. Well said.
Yeah, I've often said that the strategic plan is kind of a filter through which you push every decision, right? So does it help me get there? Does it not help me get there? If it
Mm.
doesn't fit through that filter, then it's probably not, you put it over here and you think about it later, right?
Yeah,
But those are things we got to do.
correct, correct. Well said. And I'd love to get your perspective on the role of competitive intelligence and market analysis when you're building your strategic plan.
Yeah, sure. So, well, if you don't understand your competition, you probably don't understand your market, right? So, so I think it's really important. Now, one of the old things, the kind of joke in grad school in our management courses was, the answer is do more market research. But
Hmm. Hmm.
that was kind of the Band-Aid for everything. But I mean, you don't want to get paralyzed around market research
Yeah.
and intelligence, right? But you also, say in the contract research industry, in the preclinical industry,
Hmm.
I need to know, say, for example, if I'm competing against Charles River, I need to know what they're up to, right? If I'm competing in the clinical segments, I need to know what those guys are up to. What are
Hmm.
the capabilities? And how do I shape up, right? So if I'm going after large pharma, what is large pharma interested in? What do my competitors do?
Yeah.
So, you clearly have to understand your competition
Hmm.
in order to win.
Yeah.
And so I think that's key. You also need to understand market size, right? I've
Hmm.
talked to lots of entrepreneurs, like, well, how big is your market?
Hmm.
Oh, I don't know. Well, if it's a $100 million market, you might need to get 40% of it to be
Hmm.
successful. Is that possible, right?
Hmm. Hmm. Hmm.
So really understanding the market and your competition is going to
Yeah.
really help you as you look at how you're going to best attack the market, and
Hmm.
maybe in some respects um, develop strengths where your competition has weaknesses, right?
Hmm. Amazing. Moving on, I've got a couple of questions for you on finance. What is your philosophy on financial leadership when it comes to scaling a business?
Well, so the first thing I really look at when I go into a business are its financials, right? The financials are kind of like the kind of like going in for a physical, right? When you look at your labs, in a business, in a medical, you look at your labs. In
Yeah,
business, you look at your financials,
correct,
right?
correct.
So I start out with the I start out with the P&L and the balance
Mm.
sheet, try to
Mm.
understand what's going on.
Yeah.
So the old saying is, you can lose money for a long time, but you can
Mm.
only run out of cash once.
Mm.
Uh, you really have to just understand those things. So as you look at, I think it's really important um, to have a strong financial leader. And in fact, when I go into a company, my two, two or three, really key partners are my CFO, my HR head, and my sales guy,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
So um,
Absolutely.
you can't execute without money to execute. And so you need to understand, like I said, where you're making money, where you're
Mm.
losing money,
Mm.
um,
Mm.
how your decisions are going to impact the cash flow of the business, because
Mm.
that obviously you have to pay people, you have to pay your bills, you have to have the working capital to fund the business. So a strong financial leader is key is a key ingredient of success, because if you don't
Mm.
understand your finances, you are
Mm.
not going to be able to scale.
Yeah. 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 And continuing with finance, what are some of the financial red flags that you commonly see in a startup, and how do you help them to address these?
Yeah, I think that it's from startup to startup, it changes. But the one base is undercapitalization is
Mm.
the pain of entrepreneurship,
Yeah.
right? The small companies in particular, and spending money on the wrong things. You'll find founders who are paying themselves a big salary,
Yeah.
and their company can't afford it.
Yeah.
Uh, or you'll find somebody goes out and hires. I had one company where um, the founder had gone out and hired a expensive management team, but didn't have any money for people to do the day-to-day work. And actually, I had a conversation with him. I said, look,
Mm.
here's the thing. You need, in a company like this, you need a strong operating person and a strong strategic person. And all the rest of these people, you don't need C's, you need director level people who can
Mm.
grow into these roles. And really had to restructure that company and in order to keep it from running out of cash.
Mm. Mm.
So, I think, the biggest issue with these small companies is really the question of capitalization
Yeah.
and utilization of that capital to
Mm. Mm. Amazing. I have time for
yeah,
two more questions for you, Tom.
sure.
Um, how do you assess and improve operational efficiency in underperforming businesses? And you've told me your key people are your CFO, your salesperson. So I'd love to get your thoughts.
Well, you're talking about underperforming people or
No, no.
underperforming?
How do when you walk in with a team into
Sure.
an underperforming business, what are the steps you take to improve efficiency?
Yeah. Well, I think the first question I ask is typically, what metrics are what are
Mm.
you tracking,
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
And a lot of times you find out they're not tracking anything, right? So
Mm.
you look at this P&L and it is what it is at the end of the month, right? So I think the key is to when I go in, is let's establish some metrics, right? On the
Mm.
sales side, sometimes it's as simple as tracking activity. What's my activity? How many customers are we talking to every
Mm.
week? Okay. How many customer contacts do we have?
Mm.
And then looking at the quotas by salesperson. And it seems very simple, but a lot of companies don't have
Mm.
um, sales goals. I got a sales team that's been around for a long time. They do a pretty good job. They got some good relationships. Well, but what are they doing to develop that business?
Mm.
How and um, you look at on the financial side when companies aren't performing, you start looking at working capital. You look at days sales outstanding, right? You have the days
Mm.
payable. You'll find companies with 90 days sales outstanding and they've got 10 days payables outstanding. So they're not managing their cash flow very
Yeah,
well.
yeah.
There's lots of sort of very just key sort of metrics. You look at in a production business or in the drug development world, sometimes you look at your first time pass rate, right? So what
Mm.
is my first time pass? How many times do I have to run something in order to get it? Or customer satisfaction metrics. So all of these things across the company is each group needs specific metrics that they're driving toward that can help you manage the company.
Mm.
And once you build that dashboard, then you have an ability to really understand how the actions of the team,
Mm.
what the actions the team are taking, how that's driving business performance. But I think
Mm.
that's the first thing I do when I
Mm.
go in.
Mm. Mm.
Understand what are we tracking? We're not tracking the right things. What do we need to track?
Yeah, yeah.
And then how do we take actions that make positive impacts in those metrics?
Mm. Well said. And my last question, you've told me all the areas that you look at for an underperforming company. Um, when you go into a high performing company, what are some of the differences that you see when you compare it with an underperforming company?
Yeah, it's kind of funny because I typically don't end up going into high performing companies.
Okay.
I'm trying to turn them into high performing
Okay.
companies, right?
Okay.
But yeah, I'm working with a company right now that's got really strong leadership. And I think what's really distinguished them is the market's kind of tough right now, particularly in drug development.
Mm.
The market's changing. It's been pretty tough, but strong leaders with
Mm.
strong teams. When you look at a high performing company, you're going to find a strong leader who's surrounded by a strong team and a leader who listens to those people and empowers them to take the
Mm.
actions in
Mm.
their state.
Mm.
And so the key to that really is people and having good people and letting them
Yeah.
do their work.
Mm.
And in companies that underperform, you find uh, sometimes control freaks, people at the top who want to make every decision,
Mm.
which leads to bad decisions, unhappy people, and an inability to scale,
Mm.
right? And so you have that, and then the other thing in high performing companies that I see are strong systems and processes, right?
Mm.
data, and that data is used to make decisions, right?
Mm.
A friend of mine said, God we trust, everybody else brings data.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. Yeah.
But I mean, I think those are the keys. Good
Well
teams,
said.
good metrics.
Well said. And on that note, Tom, thank you so much for speaking to me. I think just speaking to me and listening to your amazing wisdom from years of experience gives so many interesting thoughts, so many interesting strategies, so many interesting directions that my viewers and listeners can learn from. Thank you for speaking to me and
Great.
good luck to you.
Well, thank you very much. It's been a lot of fun, and I look forward to seeing what comes out.
Thank you. Thank you for listening to the Brand Called You videocast and podcast, a platform that brings you knowledge, experience, and wisdom of hundreds of successful individuals from around the world. Do visit our website www.tbcy.in to watch and listen to the stories of many more individuals. You can also follow us on YouTube, Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. Just search for the Brand Called You.